Her name was Raina. She was valedictorian of her class and a wonderful follower of Jesus, and she had decided that she was going to become a medical missionary. So she went off to college and she began to study, and she was doing great. One weekend, the girls got together and the girls decided, hey, we're going to head on home and see our families. So they all jumped in the car together and they headed down the road, and it was a long journey. And like most college kids, they hadn't had a whole lot of sleep the night before. And as they headed on down the road, all of them fell asleep in the car. The car veered off the road and Raina was killed. Her mom was devastated. Where is God? Does he care? In fact, she had such an emptiness in her life that she didn't want to live herself. She had gone into the dark night of the soul. We went to visit Mark and Kathleen, and Mark is like a brother to me. Practically grew up in my house, and we're very close. And then Mark met Kathleen. Kathleen is always happy and bubbly, and they just made a wonderful couple. They got married and ended up moving off to South Dakota. And we were there visiting with them. And while we were there, Mark says to us, Kathleen is having some problems. The other day, she was trying to fill out an online job application, and she was having all kinds of problems. And he said, I don't understand it. It was really easy. Why couldn't she do that? And then he realized that she couldn't tell time on a clock with hands. So he made an appointment with the doctor and soon got the news that would rock his world like he never knew that it could. She had the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. Things progressed quickly, and Mark finally had to put her in a nursing home because he couldn't leave her home alone for fear that she would hurt herself or burn down the house. And so he and the kids and the grandkids would go and visit her in the nursing home, and they would take her out for a picnic. And Kathleen thought it was so great that this family would come by and take her out with them. She didn't know who they were. And where is God? Does he care? I don't know what Mark is going through, but I know it has to be tough. But I do know that it's a dark night of the soul. I'm going to call her Jessie. Jessie came by the food pantry a few weeks ago and pulled up, and I just happened to be helping that week, and I began to speak with her, and she told me that she was a trainer in one of the gyms nearby here, and she said, you know, I've been off work because they've closed all the gyms down because of COVID. She said, I haven't worked for 5 months. And she said, you know, I know that the state is deferring my rent and all, but sooner or later I'm going to have to pay that. And I've got other bills to pay as well. She said, I'm kind of stuck because I can't go out and really find another job because they're still paying my health insurance, which is wonderful. But she said, I just feel stuck and I'm embarrassed to be here. But this food is going to help me pay some bills. I'm desperate. And where is God? Does he care? Jessie's world has come crashing down, and she's entered the dark night of the soul. Have you ever experienced that dark night? Maybe you're in it right now. You see, life has a way of taking us into the dark night along this earthly journey, doesn't it? We all experience it in some way, shape, or form. We've been in a series here recently called Own It. It's focusing on your emotional health and how it affects our faith. Owning it in the sense of being honest about the emotional needs that we have and even their impact on our faith. How we need to quit living in denial and start facing the truth that our emotional health does affect our faith. Well, in the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, we find a story of Abraham, and Abraham went through several dark nights. God approaches Abraham and he chooses him for a great mission, and he promises him that he will be the father of a great nation. One problem: Abraham was 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90. Now that's a problem for Abraham, but it wasn't a problem for God. And soon Sarah was pregnant, and she had a son, and they named him Isaac. God was keeping his promise. Now it all made sense. And then, chapter 22 of the story. It seems that somewhere along the way, we all eventually find ourselves in chapter 22. Follow along with me, would you? Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you. So the next morning, Abraham got up early, and he saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire for a burnt offering and set out for the place that God had told him about. And on the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. Stay here with the donkey, Abraham told the servants. The boy and I will travel a little farther, and we will worship there, and then we'll come right back. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as the 2 of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father. Yes, my son. We have the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham said. They both walked on together. And when they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. I mean, you've got to be kidding me, right? I mean, you can't tell me that Abraham wasn't questioning God. I mean, the writer obviously didn't know what was going on in Abraham's head, but he had to be saying, God, I held on to your promise. God, how could you let this happen? What kind of God are you? I've been obedient to you. Why? It all seemed to be working out. Have you been there? The sense of unbelief and disillusionment and abandonment by God. It was a dark night of the soul for Abraham as he tied his son on the altar. Now you have to realize the pagan world that Abraham was a part of, he knew child sacrifice. But tears had to be coming down his face as the son that he loved and the key to the promise that God had made him. And Isaac, old enough to understand and confused and scared. But Father, why are you doing this? Most of us know the ending to this story, but Abraham didn't know at that time. And I'm sure that his heart was being ripped from his chest to sacrifice the son that he loved so much, the one that seemed to be the answer to God's promise. It was some years ago that a group of radio evangelists got together with a social scientist, and they asked him to analyze why people would listen to their radio show. What are they listening for, they said. So they gave him all kinds of letters, thousands and thousands of letters that people had sent in to them, and they said, we want you to look at these and let us know what you find. So he gathered them together around a table and began to give them the report. And it seemed kind of long and technical, and finally somebody broke in and said, can you just summarize it for us? And he said, you know what? I can do that. In fact, all of these letters tell me that people are listening to you for one reason and an answer to one question. They want to know, does God care when my baby cries? Does God care at all? Does God care when the doctor announces cancer over my life? Does God care when my kids break my heart? Does God care when my parents treat me poorly? Does God care when my loved one is suddenly gone? Does God care when my job no longer exists? And this morning, I want to assure you that yes, God cares for you deeply, but life takes us to these places, doesn't it? And if you're in the dark night of the soul, I want you to know this morning that it's okay to own up to it. You're not the only one who is there or will be there. When you admit that you're in the depths of the darkness, that's when you can begin to get help. You need to cry out to God about it. Ray Dunning says, the essence of faith is wrestling with God. I like that. Even the word Israel probably means those who wrestle with God. And when you're in the dark night, it's okay to wrestle with the side of God that you don't understand. Psalm 77 is a prayer about wrestling with God in the dark night of the soul. The writer wants God to pay attention. Have you been there? Listen as I read here. Listen to the pain in these words. He says, I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long, I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for his help. You don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. I think of the good old days, long since ended, when my nights were filled with joyful songs. I search my soul and ponder the difference now. Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? Is his unfailing love gone forever? Have his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion? Do you ever talk to God like that? I mean, just raw. This is how I feel, God. You know, we usually don't because we think that we're being disrespectful. And we kind of want God to listen to us, right? But there are around 30 prayers like this in our Bible. And I have to admit that there are times that I can pray the prayers of lament and own them because I'm not happy with God. And the first thing that we need to realize is that it's okay to tell God how you feel. He can take it. To pray prayers of frustration and anger, it doesn't mean that we're faithless. People who don't have faith don't pray. Crying out to a God that we believe listens shows that we have faith. That's a beginning. So we call God out because we believe that he hears, and yet he's doing nothing. We've waited and we believe that God has slammed the door on his compassion. I mean, I've been to hospital bedsides and emergency rooms where people believe in God, but they feel that he has left or gone dark, and they just need that assurance that God is still there, because life takes us to these dark places. We need to hear the rest of Abraham's story this morning. Genesis 22:10 says, then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld him from me, your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." You see, God comes through for Abraham. But dark places don't always end the way that we want. We need to hear my friend Don's story, who had a brain tumor, and we prayed for God's healing, and he went through chemo, and he was allowed in a lot of different venues to speak and to share his story of God's faithfulness, and more than he'd ever shared with before. But finally, his body gave in to the disease, and my heart broke for his family. And the writer in Psalm 77 also remembers a story at the end of his rant. He says, "But then I recall all that you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They're constantly in my thoughts. I can't stop thinking about your mighty works. Oh God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations, and by your strong arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph." You see, in the midst of the dark night of the soul, we need to remember what God has done in the past, don't we? You see, the writer remembers the story of the Exodus out of Egypt. The people of Israel are slaves, and they keep crying out to a God that seemingly is not listening. But God is listening, and he's working on Moses. You see, he's working even when we don't see anything happening. In the midst of your pain and darkness, you can remember the faithfulness of God if you really try. Can you try? While Israel was crying out to God, wondering where he was, God says to Moses, "I have heard the cries of my people in Egypt." You see, in your crying, God hears you, and he is working. Trust him. Many believe that the dark night of the soul is a time when you have to experience great loss so that you can gain everything. Things of the world become meaningless. You have to lose your way so that you can begin to understand God more fully. You have to die to self to truly live. See, the dark night of the soul can be a spark for spiritual growth. We can learn more about God and who he is and our dependence on him than any other time. I can attest to that. As for the writer of Psalm 77, just remembering God's faithfulness was what got him through the dark night in the present. I believe that whenever we remember the stories of God's faithfulness, that we can come to realize that God is a fellow sufferer and he cares for us. Isaiah, the great prophet, wrote in the 61st chapter, "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory." You see, Isaiah knew down in the depths of his being that God really cared. But he also knew that God was looking for a way to demonstrate that in the world. And so he shares with us these words that one day God would send someone, an anointed one who was filled with the Spirit, a Messiah, a Christ, who would be the living proof that God cares. And when Jesus arrives on the scene, he walks into the synagogue and he picks up the scroll of Isaiah and he turns to this passage and he reads it and he puts it down and he looks at them and he says, the scripture that you've just heard has been fulfilled today. Even Jesus' cousin John sends his followers to Jesus to say, are you the one? And Jesus says, you know what? Tell John what you see and hear, that the good news is being preached. God cares. And when we are hurting, when we're in the dark night of the soul, Jesus wants to participate in our suffering. He wants to hurt with us. I want you to look at these verses here in Isaiah from Jesus' point of view. Read it from the opposite side. That before that he was a preacher of good news, he had to become poor himself. Before he could bind up the wounds of the brokenhearted, Jesus knew what it was to have his heart broken. Before he could really set prisoners free from sin, he had to become a prisoner himself. Before he could comfort all who mourn, Jesus mourned and grieved himself. He knew ashes. He knew the spirit of despair. He knew what it was to suffer with us. And that is what happens when we are in the dark night of the soul. Jesus is present, and he hurts also. He's not watching from a distance. Several years back, I was in a church, and the pastor had resigned to become district superintendent there. And during that time, one of our members got a brain aneurysm, and she went into the hospital and was in a coma. And I was just a young pastor and didn't really know what to do. So I called a friend of mine who was older and more wise, and I said, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. He said, you don't do anything. You just go there and sit. I said, well, I can do that. So I went there, and I sat with him, and I prayed with him, and we sat some more. And every once in a while, we would get up, and we would go over to see how she was doing, and I would pray with him again, and we would go and sit down some more. That's all I did. And it wasn't long until she passed away. And I received this note from the family. Thanks for being there for us. It was so comforting to have you there. You knew just what to say. Presence, suffering with them, right in the midst of it. That's what matters. And sometimes in the midst of your darkest night, you can't hear from God, but it's not because he's left you. No, he's silently suffering with you. You might say, but how could God know how I feel? I mean, I lost a loved one. I'm hurt. I'm angry. I'm lonely. I'm lost. My world has caved in. How could God know how I feel? Well, let me tell you, God knows how you feel because he remembers how he felt on the day that his son died. God chose to subject himself to grief and darkness so that he could be a fellow sufferer with us. And you need to know that when your baby cries, when your heart breaks, that God's heart is already broken, that God cries first. Jesus is God's way of saying that I am with you in your deepest pain and dark night of the soul. I am there. You will never go to a place that I have not been. I love you, and I am there in the darkness with you. We don't always know the answers. We don't always have the answers for darkness and the pain. But we do have the presence of Jesus. He is there. When one of my boys was young, we used to go walking out by the river, and there were all kinds of caves and things there to explore. And he would reach up and he would grab hold of my finger. And we would walk along, and he'd fall down and get back up again and try to hold my finger just a little bit tighter this time. And then he fell down again. And I said, boy, buddy, you just seem to be falling down a lot today. And he looked at me and he said, well, Dad, I think that if you would hold my hand, I wouldn't fall. That's what God does for us. And you know, my son, he didn't fall much after that. I was hanging on to him. I was hanging on to him. And I don't know where you're at this morning. I know some of you are having a tough time. You're in a dark place and it seems like God doesn't care. But let me tell you this morning, He does. And when you're in the dark night of the soul and you can't hold on to Him, let Him hold on to you. Would you bow your heads this morning? I don't know what's going on in your life this morning. But if you found yourself in the dark night of the soul, I want to encourage you. First of all, to own it, to let God know how you feel, to be real with Him. Wrestle with Him. It's okay. And then I want you to take some time to remember the stories of His faithfulness and trust Him. And next, know that God suffers with you. You can know that He cares for you. He hurts for you like a father hurts with his child. And finally, know that He is present with you right now. And He will hold on to you even when you don't have the strength to hold on to Him. He loves you this morning.